Hey everybody, welcome back to Lookin, Growing Up Gay, Impoverished, and Forgotten. This is our official first episode, and I think I just wanted to talk about the title and why I named it what I did. So, bear with me. I'm going to try to do a chronological podcast, but I'm sure I'm going to be all over the place. So let's just jump right in. As the title says, growing up gay, forgotten, and impoverished, the other way around. But I started it with looking in because that's kind of how I felt most of my life. Always looking in from an outsider's perspective on everything, just about. I can remember events as far back as being 18 months old and up to obviously current stuff. But I've spoken with therapists, and mainly about my parents, but also certain events in my life that I remember, but seeing them from across the road or outside of a window, in some cases, and those are signs when you see yourself as as an onlooker. As it was explained to me, it's a sign of abuse of some kind or tragic events, stuff like that. So, that kind of was the premise for my title, Looking In, because, as I said, that's kind of how I've always seen, these milestones or breakthrough points in my life. One example is I can see my mom with suitcases and me and my brother standing on the corner at the end of a street, and our house was at the end of the street, and I don't know how old I was. I had to be at least 4 and my brother 2, but I see it from standing across the road. And when I brought that up to my mom years ago, she said that was one of the times that she had left my father. And, growing up when we were young, my father was an alcoholic. So, I could imagine that was probably the main reason why she was leaving. But that's how I see a lot of points like that. Third person, which is just weird. So that was, that explains, the first part of the title. Growing up gay in a small country town outside of Rome, New York, it wasn't, you're talking back in the 70s, nobody ever talked about it. We certainly didn't share our feelings in my family at all. So it was tough, pretending. I knew pretty much from 7th grade on what my, I hate to use the word preferences because I don't think it's a preference, but you know what I mean. I knew what I was attracted to, let's say that. And, but growing up Catholic, it certainly wasn't something we talked about, when we were all young kids. My family we're pretty good churchgoers. We went every Sunday, and my grandparents were there, and aunts and uncles, it was a family thing. And, that's all we had pounded into our head was you grow up, you get married, you have kids. So that's what I did. I grew up, got married, and had kids. And it wasn't until later on that, I came out. I came out late, 33. But I was back to, the whole why I call this podcast what it is. So, I went to school, Holland Patton High School, And it's funny because, after we all graduated and, throughout reunions and stuff like that, found out that obviously I was not the only one in high school. There were several others. And my friend, she always says all the time, that explains why I couldn't get any dates, because all the guys I hung around were gay. And it was pretty much true. But, and then, you've got the 80s when, the whole AIDS crisis came about. And then, people certainly weren't talking about, being gay and coming out and stuff like that. So that's, that's that part of the title. Impoverished, we grew up so stinking poor, it's not even funny. I remember, we kind of joke about it now, but, we remember, eating potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. My mom used to have to lock cabinet doors so that we'd have breakfast in the morning, because my father would get up and, eat like a box of cereal in the middle of the night, and then we would have nothing for breakfast before we went to school. So, yeah, we, most of my dad's vehicles were hand-me-downs from my grandfather. It was difficult. We grew up, 6 of us in a 10 by 50 trailer in a trailer park in Floyd, New York, which, I don't begrudge anybody living in a trailer. My first marriage, we bought a mobile home and lived in a trailer. So it is what it is. I certainly don't have any hard feelings about that. It was just 6 people in this 10 by 50 space was a lot. Let's see. So the last part of this title breakdown, Forgotten. Again, that's a lot of how I felt growing up. My parents had no interest in anything that we did, especially school-wise. It was an annoyance if the school called them, even for an emergency, to come get one of us out, from school because we were sick or injured or whatever. It was, an aggravation for them because it interrupted their lives. And so being forgotten, it's not a great feeling. I had lots of opportunities presented to me from teachers to do different events and go places, mainly because I was an art major. And, if it wasn't for one teacher, there were, a lot of things I probably wouldn't have done or gotten to see, because he kind of took me under his wing and, paid for me to go to New York City one time when there was a art council trip. And, we went to go see the Guggenheim and stuff like that. But, my parents couldn't even be bothered to drive me to school to get on the bus. This teacher actually drove to my house and got me, and then, brought me back to school. So that kind of crap that went on. Even when we won awards and stuff like that, they didn't really care. Being an art student, I had a few, pieces of artwork that were put on display for different shows and stuff like that. And, they would send letters home to the parents, and my parents never had an interest to go and see or anything like that. They always, say that they were proud of us, but never really showed it. It's hard to explain that. I remember when I applied to MVCC and went there, the first words out of my dad was like, oh, it's great, you're the first one to go to college out of our family, but don't expect any help. I can't help you out. So, I had to work through college, which is not it's fine. I'm glad that I did it that way, because, everything I got, I worked for. It was mine. It was, I didn't have to rely on anybody. I bought my first car mowing lawns and paid my own insurance and, took care of it myself. So, there was never the opportunity for anybody to say, like, do this or you can't drive your car. Because, like, well, it's my car. I paid for it, so you can't tell me I can't drive it. But, I remember, like, I had a Mazda RX-4 and it needed a fuel pump. And instead of my dad giving me $200 to get that fixed, he made me borrow $1,200 from him to go get this piece of shit Chevy Vega that burnt a quart of oil in the morning to get to school and another quart to get back home. So, yeah. So that's a little bit more than what I was going to say about being forgotten. But that's, just how I felt, growing up, because, we just didn't, we were never acknowledged on anything that we accomplished or did, and it's not just me. My siblings can attest to this also. So it was I'll talk about it, in other episodes, but my father passed away in 2024 and about a year ago. And, there's a lot of mixed feelings between all of us siblings, and, a little bit of arguments, sometimes about how things should be handled and how we felt, but it brought us all together. But again, we'll talk about that another time. Let's see, what else? I think that's about it as far as why I call this podcast, Looking In, Growing Up Gay, Impoverished and Forgotten. I think it summarizes my feelings of my life. Growing up anyways. I mean, when we get into this, around 2009, it took that long, but around 2009, my life really, really changed, and we'll get into that, and you'll learn why, and hopefully, you stick with me, and you'll listen to these little blurbs of my life, and feel free to send me a message or comment on something, or if you feel like I've lost you along the way, I'm glad to try to reconnect the dots for you. But that's it for today, and I hope you have a good day. God bless, and we'll talk to you next time. Ciao.